Sarah Middleton was a woman who had once been defined by her aspirations and dreams, but now found herself entangled in the complexities of her own choices. She was 32 years old, with a career in marketing that had seen a steady rise over the years. Originally from a small town in Ohio, Sarah had moved to New York City after college, lured by the promise of excitement and opportunity that the city offered. She was intelligent, ambitious, and undeniably attractive, with long chestnut hair and a pair of piercing green eyes that had once captivated her husband Mark. Mark Middleton, 34, was a man of simpler tastes. Raised in a working-class family in Pennsylvania, he had grown up with a strong sense of duty and loyalty. After earning a degree in civil engineering, he secured a stable job in a reputable construction firm in New York. Mark was the kind of man who believed in hard work, integrity, and the sanctity of marriage. He had an athletic build, a kind smile, and a pair of steady blue eyes that exuded warmth and reliability. To his friends and colleagues, he was the epitome of a devoted husband, a man who would move mountains for his wife. Sarah and Mark had met in their mid-20s at a mutual friend's party. Mark was immediately smitten by Sarah's confidence and wit, while Sarah was drawn to Mark's stability and the sense of security he offered. Their relationship had progressed quickly, with Mark proposing within 2 years of dating. Their wedding was a beautiful affair, attended by friends and family who marveled at how perfect they seemed together. For the first few years of their marriage, everything appeared idyllic. They bought a cozy apartment in Brooklyn, went on vacations, and planned for a future that seemed bright and full of promise. However, as time went on, the excitement that had once characterized the relationship began to fade. Sarah, who thrived on novelty and excitement, found herself growing increasingly restless. The routine of married life, once a comfort, began to feel suffocating. Mark, content with his steady job and their comfortable life, didn't notice the subtle changes in Sarah's demeanor. He was often engrossed in his work, spending long hours at the construction sites, leaving Sarah alone for extended periods. The thrill that had once been so palpable in their relationship was now replaced by a mundane rhythm that Sarah found herself resenting. It was during one of these lonely stretches that Sarah met Jason Reynolds. Jason was everything Mark was not: spontaneous, daring, and full of life. At 29 years old, he was a rising star in the world of finance, working as an investment banker in Manhattan. Jason was originally from Miami, Florida, and had a natural charisma that made him the center of attention wherever he went. With his chiseled features, dark hair, and a confident swagger, he quickly caught Sarah's eye when they met at a corporate networking event. Their initial conversations were light and professional, but there was an undeniable spark between them. Jason was quick to flirt, and Sarah found herself drawn to his boldness. He was the antithesis of Mark. Where Mark was methodical and steady, Jason was impulsive and adventurous. The thrill of their clandestine interactions was intoxicating for Sarah. She felt alive in a way she hadn't in years, and soon their innocent conversations turned into something much more dangerous. It started with drinks after work, which quickly escalated to late-night dinners in hidden corners of the city, far away from prying eyes. Before long, Sarah and Jason were entangled in a full-blown affair. They met whenever they could, and each encounter was a whirlwind of passion and excitement that left Sarah craving more. With Jason, she felt a freedom that had been absent from her life for so long. She convinced herself that what she had with Jason was harmless, a way to reclaim the excitement she had lost. But deep down, Sarah knew the truth. She was playing a dangerous game, one that could destroy everything she and Mark had built together. Still, the temptation was too strong, and she continued to see Jason, convincing herself that she could keep both worlds separate. Months passed, and the affair became increasingly reckless. Jason began pressing Sarah to leave Mark, promising her a life of excitement and luxury if she would just take the leap. The idea was tempting, but Sarah was hesitant. She knew Mark didn't deserve the betrayal, but at the same time, the thought of returning to her life with him, devoid of the thrill she now craved, filled her with dread. One evening, after a particularly passionate encounter with Jason, they lay in bed discussing their future. Jason, as always, was urging Sarah to leave Mark. "You deserve better than this," he said, his voice full of conviction. "You deserve someone who makes you feel alive." Sarah sighed, torn between guilt and desire. "I know," she replied, "but it's not that simple. Mark isn't a bad person. He's been nothing but good to me. I don't know if I can hurt him like that." Jason propped himself up on one elbow, looking down at her with a mixture of frustration and tenderness. "Sarah, you can't keep living a lie. You're miserable with him. You've said it yourself. It's time to make a choice." The weight of his words hung in the air, and Sarah felt a pang of anxiety. She knew he was right. She couldn't continue living a double life forever. But the thought of the fallout, of the pain she would cause Mark, made her stomach turn. She had never been a cruel person, and the idea of hurting someone who loved her so deeply was almost unbearable. "I need time," she whispered, more to herself than to Jason. "Time's running out, Sarah," Jason said softly. "You know where to find me when you're ready." They spent the rest of the night together, but Sarah's mind was elsewhere. She was lost in a maze of conflicting emotions, trying to reconcile the person she had become with the woman she once was. The next morning, Sarah returned home, her thoughts still clouded with doubt. She hadn't noticed that Mark had taken the day off from work. He was in the kitchen, making coffee, when she walked in. Sarah forced a smile, hoping to hide her inner turmoil. "Morning," Mark greeted her with a warm smile. "You're up early." "Yeah, couldn't sleep," Sarah replied, avoiding his gaze. Mark frowned, noticing the tension in her voice. "Everything okay?" "Yeah, just a lot on my mind," she said quickly, brushing off this concern. Mark nodded, not wanting to push her. He knew she had been stressed with work lately, and assumed that was the cause of her unease. Little did he know that the real reason for her anxiety was standing right in front of him. As the days passed, Sarah's internal struggle grew more intense. She was caught in a web of lies that was becoming increasingly difficult to manage. Every time she looked at Mark, she felt a pang of guilt, but the thought of leaving him for Jason was equally terrifying. She couldn't bring herself to make a decision, so she continued to live in limbo, hoping that something would change. But things did change, just not in the way she expected. One evening, Sarah and Jason met at their usual spot, a small boutique hotel in Midtown. They had planned to discuss their future, but the conversation quickly turned heated. Jason was growing impatient, and his frustration was starting to show. "Sarah, we can't keep doing this," he said, his voice edged with tension. "You need to make a choice." I know, Sarah replied, her voice trembling. "But it's not that simple. I can't just walk away from my life." "Why not?" Jason shot back. "You're not happy. You deserve to be with someone who makes you happy." "Mark doesn't deserve this," Sarah said quietly. "He's a good man. I can't just destroy him like that." Jason sighed, running a hand through his hair. "What about me, Sarah? What about us? Do we not deserve a chance?" Sarah looked at him, her heart aching. "I don't know what to do," she admitted. "I'm so confused." Jason reached out and took her hand, his grip firm. "Then let me make it simple for you. Leave him. Leave him, and we can start a new life together. I promise you, Sarah, I'll make you happy." Sarah's mind raced. Could she really do it? Could she walk away from Mark and everything they had built together? The thought of starting over with Jason was both thrilling and terrifying. She knew she was standing at a crossroads, and whichever path she chose would change her life forever. "I need more time," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Jason's expression softened, but there was a hint of impatience in his eyes. "Okay," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "But don't take too long. We can't keep doing this forever." Sarah nodded, feeling the weight of his words. She knew he was right. Time was running out, and sooner or later she would have to make a choice. But for now, all she could do was try to keep her two worlds from colliding. They parted ways that night, with Sarah promising herself that she would make a decision soon. She couldn't keep living this double life. It was tearing her apart. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. And she was right. The days following Sarah's last encounter with Jason were filled with an unbearable tension. The weight of her indecision hung over her like a storm cloud, growing darker and more ominous with each passing day. She tried to go about her routine, but nothing felt normal anymore. Every smile she forced at work, every casual conversation she had with Mark felt like a lie. The life she once thought was secure had become a fragile facade, threatening to shatter at any moment. Mark noticed the change in Sarah, but he didn't know what to make of it. She was distant, distracted, and seemed to be carrying a heavy burden that she refused to share. He tried to talk to her, to understand what was going on, but every time he broached the subject, Sarah would brush him off with a vague excuse about stress from work. Mark, ever the considerate husband, didn't press further. He told himself that it was just a rough patch and that things would get better with time. But time, as Sarah knew all too well, was running out. A week after her last meeting with Jason, the tension in Sarah's life reached a breaking point. It was a Friday evening, and Mark had planned a quiet dinner at home, hoping to reconnect with his wife. He had cooked her favorite meal and even bought a bottle of wine from the vineyard they had visited on their honeymoon. He wanted to remind her of the good times they had shared, to show her that their life together was still worth fighting for. Sarah came home that evening, exhausted and emotionally drained. The moment she stepped through the door, she was hit by the smell of her favorite dish cooking in the kitchen. It should have made her feel comforted, but instead, it only deepened her guilt. She knew Mark was trying, and it made her feel like the worst person in the world for betraying him. Mark greeted her with a warm smile, taking her coat and leading her to the dining table. "I thought we could have a nice dinner tonight," he said, trying to hide the anxiety in his voice. "Just the two of us." Sarah forced a smile, trying to suppress the turmoil raging inside her. "That sounds nice," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. They sat down to eat, and Mark poured them each a glass of wine. He tried to make conversation, asking about her day and telling her about a project he was working on at the construction site. But Sarah's responses were short, and her mind was elsewhere. She couldn't focus on what he was saying. All she could think about was the decision she needed to make. Mark noticed her distraction, but he didn't know how to break through the wall she had built around herself. Finally, he put down his fork and looked at her with concern. "Sarah, what's going on?" he asked gently. "You've been so distant lately. Is there something you want to talk about?" Sarah felt a lump form in her throat. She couldn't tell him the truth. Not now, not like this. But the guilt was too much to bear, and she could feel herself crumbling under the pressure. "It's just work," she lied, her voice trembling. "I have been really stressed out." Mark reached across the table and took her hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "You know you can talk to me about anything, right? I'm here for you." Sarah nodded, fighting back tears. She wanted to tell him everything, to come clean and confess her affair with Jason. But the words wouldn't come. She was too afraid of the consequences, too afraid of losing the life they had built together. So instead, she swallowed her guilt and forced herself to smile. "I know," she said softly. "Thank you." Mark smiled back, relieved to see some warmth return to her expression. He squeezed her hand again before letting go and returning to his meal. "I'm just glad we're spending some time together," he said, trying to lighten the mood. "It feels like we've both been so busy lately." Sarah nodded, but she didn't say anything. The rest of the meal passed in uncomfortable silence, with Mark trying to make small talk and Sarah barely responding. When dinner was finally over, she excused herself and went to bed early, claiming she was tired. Mark didn't protest. He simply cleared the dishes and cleaned up the kitchen, all the while wondering what had happened to the woman he had married. The next day, Sarah woke up feeling even worse. The guilt was gnawing at her, and she knew she couldn't keep up the charade much longer. She needed to make a decision, and she needed to make it soon. But every time she thought about leaving Mark, she was overwhelmed with fear and doubt. She couldn't imagine her life without him, but at the same time, she couldn't deny the pull she felt toward Jason. That evening, while Mark was out running errands, Sarah decided to call Jason. She needed to talk to him to clear her head and figure out what to do. She dialed his number, and after a few rings, he picked up. "Sarah," Jason's voice came through the line, sounding relieved. "I was starting to think you were avoiding me." "I'm sorry," Sarah replied, her voice shaky. "I've just been so confused lately. I don't know what to do." There was a pause on the other end of the line before Jason spoke again, his tone serious. "Sarah, we can't keep doing this. You need to make a decision. I know it's hard, but you can't keep living like this." "I know," Sarah whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "But I'm scared, Jason. I'm scared of what will happen if I leave him." "I'll be there for you," Jason assured her. "You don't have to go through this alone. We can be together, Sarah. We can have the life we've always talked about." Sarah closed her eyes, trying to picture the life Jason was offering. It sounded so tempting, so full of possibility. But then she thought about Mark, about the man who had stood by her side through thick and thin. Could she really throw all of that away? "I need more time," she said finally, her voice trembling. I can't do this right now." Jason sighed, and Sarah could hear the frustration in his voice. "I understand," he said, though he didn't sound happy about it. "But Sarah, you need to make a decision soon. We can't keep going on like this." "I know," Sarah replied, wiping away her tears. "I'll figure it out, I promise." They ended the call, and Sarah was left alone with her thoughts. She felt more lost than ever, torn between two lives that seemed impossible to reconcile. She knew she couldn't keep going on like this, but she didn't know how to find her way out. A few days later, everything came crashing down. It was a Saturday morning, and Sarah was in the kitchen making coffee when she received a call from the police. The officer on the other end of the line introduced himself and asked if she was Sarah Middleton. "Yes, this is she," Sarah replied, her heart pounding. "Is everything okay?" "I'm afraid I have some bad news, Mrs. Middleton," the officer said, his tone serious. "We found a man matching your husband's description in a nearby hospital. He's in critical condition. We need you to come down and identify him." Sarah's blood ran cold. "What? What happened? Is he going to be okay?" "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I don't have any more details at this time. Please come to the hospital as soon as you can." The call ended, and Sarah stood frozen in the kitchen, her mind racing. Mark was in the hospital. How could that be? She had seen him just that morning before he left to run errands. Her hands trembled as she grabbed her keys and rushed out the door, her heart pounding in her chest. The drive to the hospital felt like a blur. Sarah's mind was filled with a million thoughts, all of them terrifying. What had happened to Mark? Was he hurt? Was he going to die? She couldn't lose him, not now, not like this. She prayed silently, begging for Mark to be okay. When she arrived at the hospital, she was greeted by a stern-looking doctor who guided her through the sterile corridors to the intensive care unit. The doctor's expression was grim, and Sarah's anxiety skyrocketed. "Mrs. Middleton," the doctor said as they reached the entrance to the ICU, "I need to prepare you for what you're about to see. The man we found is in critical condition, and his injuries are severe. We haven't been able to remove the object from him yet." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "Object? What are you talking about?" The doctor hesitated, clearly reluctant to go into detail. "I think it's best if you see for yourself. But I must warn you, it's not easy to look at." With that ominous warning, the doctor pushed open the door to the ICU. Sarah stepped inside, her legs trembling. She wasn't sure what she was expecting, but nothing could have prepared her for what she saw. Lying in the hospital bed, hooked up to a tangle of machines, was not Mark. It was Jason. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she stared at him, barely recognizing the man she had been so passionately involved with. Jason's face was pale and gaunt, his eyes closed as he lay unconscious. But it wasn't just his appearance that shocked Sarah. It was the sight of the grotesque object protruding from his abdomen. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she stood frozen in the ICU, her eyes locked on the horrifying sight before her. Jason Reynolds lay in the hospital bed, his usually vibrant features now pale and drawn. He was surrounded by a web of beeping machines and medical equipment, but it was the grotesque object protruding from his abdomen that made Sarah's stomach churn. The object was an intricately designed metal device, cruelly twisted into a shape that seemed both artistic and horrifying. It was clear that it had been inserted with a purpose. There was no doubt it was meant to be a message, a testament to a rage so intense it had manifested into something beyond Sarah's darkest nightmares. The object seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the machines, a grotesque reminder of the violence that had been inflicted upon Jason. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to comprehend what she was seeing. The doctor's words echoed in her ears, warning her of the severity of Jason's condition and the nature of his injuries, but none of it prepared her for the sight of the device that had been used to torment him. She had no idea how to process the reality that her lover was suffering in such a horrifying manner. Her hands trembled as she struggled to steady her breathing. A nurse came over to her, a sympathetic look on her face. "Are you Sarah Middleton?" she asked softly. "Yes," Sarah replied, her voice barely audible. "I'm sorry you had to see him like this," the nurse said. "I'll leave you alone for a moment, but please remember that we're doing everything we can to help him." Sarah nodded absently, her eyes still fixed on Jason. The nurse left her alone, and Sarah's thoughts spiraled into chaos. She felt a crushing guilt wash over her, not only for the role she had played in Jason's current state, but also for the fact that Mark was somehow implicated in this horrific situation. As Sarah stood there, she tried to piece together the events that had led to this moment. She had been so wrapped up in her own turmoil that she hadn't seen the signs of what was happening around her. Mark's sudden disappearance, his peculiar absence, and now Jason's brutal condition, it all seemed connected in a way she couldn't quite grasp. Her mind flashed back to the last conversation she had with Jason. They had talked about their future, their dreams, and the life they wanted to build together. But now, that future seemed to be slipping away, replaced by a nightmare she couldn't escape. She thought about Mark, who had always been the steadfast, reliable partner, and wondered how he could have become involved in something so violent. As the hours ticked by, Sarah remained by Jason's bedside, her thoughts a tumult of fear, guilt, and confusion. She tried to avoid looking directly at the device, focusing instead on Jason's face and the slow rise and fall of his chest. The doctors had said they would need time to stabilize him and decide on the next course of action, but Sarah knew that the emotional trauma of the situation was far beyond the medical prognosis. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Sarah decided she needed to leave the hospital. She needed to find answers, to understand how this could have happened, and most importantly, to figure out how to make things right. As she walked through the sterile corridors of the hospital, her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. She had to confront Mark, had to find out what he knew, and how he had ended up in this nightmare. Returning home, Sarah found the apartment eerily quiet. The normalcy of her surroundings seemed surreal in the face of the horror she had just witnessed. She moved through the apartment like a ghost, her steps heavy, and her heart weighed down by a suffocating dread. Her first instinct was to search for any clues that might explain Mark's actions. She rummaged through their bedroom, looking for anything that might hint at his whereabouts or his state of mind. Her search was frantic and unorganized, driven by a desperation to find answers. Among the scattered papers and personal belongings, she came across a journal that Mark had kept. It was a small leather-bound book, and as Sarah flipped through its pages, she discovered entries that revealed a side of Mark she had never known. The entries were filled with notes about his growing suspicions and his feelings of betrayal. Mark had written about his growing concern for Sarah's well-being and his worries about the changes in her behavior. But the most shocking revelation came in the last few entries, where Mark had detailed his discovery of Sarah's affair with Jason. He had written about his plan to confront Jason, his feelings of hurt and anger, and the steps he had taken to gather evidence. The entries were a painful read, exposing the depth of Mark's anguish and the extent of his emotional suffering. Sarah felt a pang of guilt as she realized the extent to which her actions had hurt him. It was clear that Mark had been deeply wounded, but she hadn't realized the lengths to which he had gone in his quest for answers. Sarah sat on the edge of their bed, clutching the journal, tears streaming down her face. She couldn't believe how things had spiraled out of control. Mark's final entries revealed a man who was broken and desperate for resolution, someone who had been driven to a point of no return. The realization hit her hard. Mark had been pushed to the brink, and the pain he felt had manifested into something monstrous. Determined to find Mark and make sense of everything, Sarah decided to go to the police. She needed to understand what had happened and what had driven Mark to such extreme measures. She found herself at the police station recounting everything she knew about Mark's disappearance and the events leading up to it. The detective assigned to the case listened intently as Sarah explained her side of the story. He took notes and asked questions, but the look in his eyes revealed a growing sense of understanding. Finally, after a long and grueling interview, the detective assured Sarah that they would continue to investigate and try to piece together the full story. As Sarah left the police station, her mind was heavy with the weight of her actions and the consequences they had wrought. She knew that Mark had been driven by pain and anger, and she realized that his actions, though extreme, were born from a place of profound hurt. She had to confront him, to find him, and apologize for the damage she had caused. Hours later, Sarah found herself at a remote warehouse on the outskirts of the city, a location Mark had frequented according to his journal. It was a dilapidated building, its exterior covered in grime and graffiti. The place seemed like a relic from a forgotten era, and as Sarah approached, she felt a sense of foreboding. Inside, she found Mark. He was sitting in a makeshift office, surrounded by old files and photographs. His face was haggard and drawn, and his eyes were hollow. The sight of him, so defeated and broken, nearly brought Sarah to her knees. She had never seen him like this before. "Mark," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Mark looked up at her, his expression a mixture of pain and resignation. "Sarah," he said, his voice hoarse, "you shouldn't have come here." "I had to," Sarah replied, tears streaming down her face. "I needed to understand. I needed to know why this happened." Mark's gaze softened slightly, but his pain was still evident. "I found out about your affair," he said quietly. "I was devastated. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to confront Jason, to make him understand the hurt he had caused." Sarah's heart ached as she listened to Mark's words. She could see the depth of his suffering, and she realized how deeply she had hurt him. "I'm so sorry," she repeated. "I never wanted any of this. I just—" Mark cut her off, his voice filled with anguish. "I know you're sorry, Sarah, but the damage has been done. Jason's in the hospital because of me. I went too far." Sarah shook her head, trying to process the enormity of Mark's actions. "You didn't have to go to such extremes. We could have talked about it. We could have found a different way." Mark looked at her with a mixture of guilt and resignation. "I didn't know how to handle it. I felt betrayed and powerless. I thought I could fix things, but I only made them worse." The two of them sat in silence, the weight of their shared pain heavy in the air. Sarah realized that their relationship, once so full of promise, had been irreparably damaged. The trust that had bound them together had been shattered, and there was no going back. After a long and emotional conversation, Mark and Sarah both understood that their relationship could not be repaired. The damage was too deep, and the trust was too broken. They decided to part ways, acknowledging that they had both been changed by the events that had transpired. Mark turned himself in to the authorities, admitting his role in Jason's injuries. He faced legal consequences for his actions, but Sarah knew that the true punishment was the emotional toll it had taken on him. She watched as Mark was led away, her heart heavy with regret. As for Sarah, she faced the aftermath of her actions with a sense of profound sorrow. She visited Jason in the hospital, apologizing for the pain she had caused and trying to make amends. Though Jason's condition improved over time, the scars of their twisted affair remained.